Introduce Tarli, and so I think I know most people, but for those that don't know me, my name is James Donald. So I did my PhD here. I now work over at the University of Sydney in the business school there, but enjoy collaborating with all you wonderful people here. And,
almost everybody.
Sorry, yeah, almost everybody. Yeah. But so anyway, we have a body, heart, and mind in business research group over in the business school at the University of Sydney, and Tarli Young has come from the University of Queensland as a PhD student there to spend a couple of weeks with us and to kind of collaborate with people there and look at potentially a postdoc opportunities and things like that as well. So she's kind of getting towards the latter phase of her PhD that's been looking at positive psychology, mindfulness, ACT, meaning, things that are dear to our collective hearts, I would say, and so I thought there'd be, some value for her and potentially for the broader group in hearing about her research. So, yeah.
Thanks, James. Thank you. It's really great to be here. Thanks for having me here. I've been in positive psychology a while and read a lot of work coming out of this group, so it's really nice to be here. As James said, I'm from the University of Queensland, so you're welcome to jump in and ask questions as I go. I just wanted to give a brief introduction about myself, talk about my research around meaning in work, and how this might connect to our ethics as well, and how this might be applied to the workplace. So to start, a little bit about me. I'm doing a PhD in the School of Psychology at UQ. I work with Kenneth Pakenham, who some of you might know from his work on acceptance commitment therapy, and we're looking at wellbeing in meaningful work. I also lecture in a positive psychology subject at UQ. I previously did my Masters of Applied Positive Psychology in East London with Itai Itzan, and we developed the Mindfulness-Based Flourishing program, which essentially combines mindfulness and positive psychology together, and that's been tested in about 6 different studies. So right now, I'm coming towards the end of my PhD, and I've focused a lot on meaningful work. It was something that was quite interesting for me because previously, before doing any research, I worked in aid and development. So I was a development worker for a long time, working in developing countries like Nepal, Nigeria, Solomon Islands. And I went into that work because I hoped it would be very meaningful. It was something I was seeking, a high level of meaning in my work. Didn't find it. And that was actually quite a common story in the aid workers around me. So I became really fascinated in what makes for meaningful work and how it can be increased. And so I chose to focus on aid workers, partly because there's very little research on them, but partly because these tend to be a group of people that seek out meaningful careers. So in terms of who are aid workers, they are people who undertake humanitarian work in conflicts, disaster zones, or they can be development workers, so working on long-term projects in developing countries around health, education, economics, that kind of thing. We often tend to think of them as international people coming into a developing country, but this is actually quite a small fraction. And we tend to think of them doing quite physical work, handing out food, that kind of thing. This is what aid work actually looks like a lot of the time. So lots of meetings, working with a computer. 90% of aid workers are nationals, as in they're from the country that they're working in. There's also an idea that they tend to be volunteers, but it's a very professionalised sector in that most people have degrees and have worked within that area for a really long time. So just to give you an idea of who this group are. So there has been not that much done on mental health in aid workers, and I think this is partly because of the tendency to focus research on the beneficiaries of aid. Very worthwhile group to focus on, but it means that the aid workers themselves are kind of missed out and stigmatised because they should be focusing on beneficiaries, so why focus on them? So far I've done 3 different studies and 2 more underway around aid workers. So first of all, mapping out their mental health. And I should say I'm using this to think not just about aid workers, but about meaningful careers more generally. So the first study was an online cross-sectional survey. We recruited aid workers through online websites and groups. So 369 aid workers from 77 different countries. It was deliberately designed to be global because they're a global population. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, we found low levels of well-being as measured by the mental health continuum, and high levels of psychological distress, depression, anxiety, stress, burnout. So this was not surprising for me. I'd seen this firsthand within the sector. Perhaps what was surprising is what predicts this poor mental health. So, for instance, trauma was not a predictor of poor mental health. That's not to say there wasn't a lot of trauma in this group, because on average we did measure traumatic events. 50% had had a traumatic event within work, another quarter had had a traumatic event out of work. On average 3 traumatic events per participant. So they had been through trauma, but it wasn't predicting poor mental health. In fact, the only thing it did predict was higher levels of personal achievement under burnout, so maybe something around post-traumatic growth going on there. This is interesting because a lot of the support for aid workers is focused on trauma, so a lot of the in-house counselling is only available for people who've been through a traumatic experience. So perhaps not targeting the right kind of things there. So I followed this up with a qualitative study to find out, okay, that's not trauma, what is stressing people out? 218 aid workers, and when we asked them about their key stresses, again, trauma and safety, these are often people working in conflict zones, in war zones, in disaster zones, but trauma and safety were not coming up as something that they cited as a key stressor. It was actually a lot of mundane things, like their bosses were annoying, their colleagues were hopeless, their workload was too much, and so, so what we're seeing is sort of mundane, not mundane, ordinary kind of issues coming through here, but exacerbated by the situation that they found themselves in. And something that came through really strongly was this problem around meaning. And so seeing the suffering of others, but having an inability to make any impact. So this sense of powerlessness, wanting to make a difference, but not being able to. So our next step was we wanted to know if we're going to improve wellbeing in this group, what should we be targeting? What sort of psychological factors should we be targeting? This hadn't been done at all before, so we tested it out with another survey, psychological flexibility. Most of you will know from acceptance commitment therapy, the ability to follow your own values in the presence of difficult thoughts, feelings and emotions. The 6 different factors we measured there. And we also measured resilience, because it's a very hot topic within the aid sector, so the ability to bounce back. And based on the qualitative work that we'd already done, measured meaning, particularly the presence of meaning. So my supervisor, being from acceptance commitment therapy, was very focused on psychological flexibility, and I added in the meaning part because I thought it was very important for aid workers. And so what we found was that all of them predicted well-being, but the presence of meaning, when we controlled for the others, the presence of meaning was the above and beyond psychological flexibility and resilience, so coming through as the strongest predictor, both of well-being and of psychological distress. So you can see that for this particular group, meaning, the presence of meaning is really an important factor. So my next studies that are underway, there isn't an intervention out there for aid workers at the moment to improve their mental health, so I've developed an online acceptance commitment therapy intervention. It's animated and online so that it's available to a global audience. So I'm doing a pilot and a randomized control trial. So that'll probably bring me to the end of my PhD, but I'm interested in taking this intervention further and applying it to other groups who work in meaningful careers, or are seeking meaningful careers. So in terms of future research, I'd like to take this, broaden it out outside of aid work and think more about what makes for meaning in work. It's something that has increasingly been the focus of people's career choices, so increasingly people are looking for more meaning within their work. There's less research around what makes for meaningful work, but we know it's affected by both individual and organisations. So in terms of what makes work meaningful, there's work out there around values, motivation, relationships. A lot of this is around why people do the work, and it has a real effect, and how they do it. But what we were seeing with aid workers is that we've got people there who are working in line with their values, they're intrinsically motivated, but they're still not getting that meaning that they're seeking. And I think what's coming through in the qualitative work is that they're not seeing the impact of what they're doing. they're doing work in line with their values but not seeing any outcomes. And so something I'd like to study more within this area is how impact fits in, making like a sense of progress. Factors that I think will be important here is the significance of the impact, the size, the importance, how it aligns with the worker's values, and proximity. So one issue is someone can be making an impact, but if they don't see that impact or they don't see the outcome, then they're not getting that feedback. So they're not able to know what's happening or see it. A sense of personal contribution to that impact and expectations. So something that came through in the qualitative work again were aid workers coming in, going to save the world. And then, you know, obviously it's a very high expectation and the sense of meaning that they have is not going to match that. So how expectations feed into this. So also I'd like to work around increasing meaning in work. So at the worker level, take the existing ACT intervention and compare it to ACT plus meaning. We already know that acceptance commitment therapy increases meaning, but what I was seeing from the data there was that targeting meaning above and beyond psychological flexibility might add something more. Also, I want to look at this idea of meaningful moments, so trying to find and spot meaning within everyday work rather than waiting for this big impact at the end that may or may not come, perhaps in the same way that strength spotting has been used. And job crafting, there's already existing work on this, so this ability for workers to change or add roles within their existing job to make them more personally meaningful. So that's at the worker level. At the organisational level, I'd like to work with organisations around removing barriers to meaning. So there's a lot of unintended barriers to meaning, things like bureaucracy, unnecessary processes. So one way of putting it is that the how of work sometimes gets in the way of why we're doing it. And so working with organisations to identify those barriers, remove them. And internal communications of impact. So this is sort of closing that feedback loop. So perhaps spotlighting, bringing in clients that have been affected by, positively affected by a particular organisation and helping them speak, getting them to speak to help the workers understand the impact of what they're doing. Anecdotally, this works very well, but I'd like to be able to study this. So one area of work that I'm currently doing, or sort of starting off on, is how ethics, our ethical frameworks connects to our meaning and our well-being in general, and then in the workplace. So this is something I'm interested in. I have a background in mindfulness research, and as anyone who's worked in mindfulness knows that traditionally it has this real ethical component to it. It's been transplanted into the West where there's less focus on the ethics of it. And so I developed my own little ethics intervention and found that it was really helpful in terms of clarity and well-being. So it's something I wanted to test a little bit more. I think this is important because in positive psychology we talk a lot about eudaimonic well-being, this long-term, meaningful, fulfilled kind of well-being. And originally, when Aristotle was talking about this in his work, he really saw eudaimonic well-being as resulting from living an ethical and virtuous life. So there was this really clear link between ethics and well-being, particularly eudaimonic well-being. So there's a long history in philosophy linking these two topics, but not so much in psychology. So when we look at current representations of eudaimonic well-being, I love this model, I use it a lot, and you can see the meaning element come through. But what you can't specifically see here is anything around ethics or morality. And I think this may be implied in some of the things, but it's not specified there. And so it's not measured, and we don't know much about how ethics predicts well-being. And so theoretically, you could be high in all of these things, but living a very unethical kind of life. So our well-being models are sort of in a bit of a moral vacuum. So I wanted to think about this, to research this link between ethics and well-being from a psychological point of view. So our ethical frameworks are the systems of principles or rules we use to navigate ethical dilemmas, what's right and wrong, the code that we use. We all have them to some extent, but we have different levels of clarity around those ethics, in the same way that you can have different levels of clarity around your values. There is a little bit So there's a research gap around this, but there is some relevant work out there. So moral identity is the extent to which it's important, you think it's important to see yourself as a moral person. That has been linked with well-being. Values, studied a lot within acceptance commitment therapy, valued life directions are linked with well-being. And things like pro-sociality and compassion, they relate to ethics, and we know that they're linked to well-being, but not quite the same thing. So, working with my colleague Tarli up at UQ, we had a few hypotheses. We thought that ethical clarity would be associated with well-being, and that this would be mediated by the extent to which the ethical framework to help people make sense of the world. So you can see this sense of meaning coming through here again. So this clarity, clarity being part of meaning. These are cross-sectional hypotheses. We also wanted to look at causation. So we hypothesized that increasing ethical clarity will increase well-being. In addition, we thought that this effect would be stronger for those who had low ethical clarity, because it's easier to give them a quick boost in ethical clarity if they initially have low levels. So we've done 2 studies so far. First one, an online cross-sectional MTurk study, 175 participants. There aren't any measures out there around ethical clarity, so we sort of made up our own. You can see this is our first one here, and this was rated from 1 to 7 on how much people agree with the statement. And this is the mediator that I was talking about, also rated 1 to 7. And then in terms of well-being, we used the mental health continuum again, because it has its 3 types of well-being bundled up together. So what we found was, yes, there was a positive association between ethical clarity and well-being, and this held after controlling for religiosity and age. And we did find, so this relationship between ethical clarity and well-being was fully mediated by the extent to which that framework helped people make sense of the world. So fully explaining that relationship. So that was good. That was study 1. Study 2 was experimental online, again with MTurk. And what we did was we randomized, we had 356 participants this time, and we randomized them into an experimental and control group. So the experimental group, the idea here was to boost ethical clarity. So the experimental group were asked to just drag and drop statements around ethical statements and choose the 5 that were most important to them, and then write, sort of free write around why they're important, how they use them in their everyday life. So it was a quick 2-minute little intervention to try to give them more clarity around their ethics and their ethical framework. So the control group did a similar task physically, but they were dragging and dropping statements around nouns. So after that, we measured ethical clarity, these same measures from study 1. So what we found was that we were able to replicate that correlation. We replicated the mediation as well. And in terms of the experimental element, we found no main effective condition. There wasn't significant effect between the active control and the experimental group, but we did find significant moderation. So what you can see here is that people who initially felt like they had low levels of ethical clarity, if they were in the experimental condition, they had higher levels of well-being than those who were in the control condition. And I think this is coming back to that hypothesis around it's easier to boost people's clarity if they don't have much clarity to start with, particularly with such a short little intervention. You can see that for the people who thought that they were high in ethical clarity, perhaps they weren't as clear as they originally thought. We don't know necessarily what's going on there, but we're guessing that they weren't, when they actually sat down to do the exercise, they weren't as clear as they originally thought, and maybe it had a negative effect, although that's not significant there. So this is a little 2-minute intervention. We should be able to overcome this dip by doing a longer intervention so people do get to boost that clarity. So I think there's quite a few implications for this, that ethics may be important for meaning and well-being. It's an idea that's been around for a while, but psychologically it hasn't really been tested that much. So I think this provides a possible additional pathway to well-being. So this is something that could be incorporated into well-being models. but also at a practical level, it could provide real motivation for using for ethics education within schools. Ethics is often seen as quite a dry topic, so if you can add the added bonus of student well-being in there, which is a very important topic, then it provides this dual motivation around teaching ethics. Also, I think something that's really important is an increased focus on ethics in organisations. Again, seen often as a dry topic, something around, just boxes that have to be ticked. But if we can link it to workplace well-being, then it adds a different motivation there. So there is a little bit, something that I'm hoping to do in the future. There is work already around how our morals affect our mental health in the workplace with a concept called moral injury. So this is essentially the negative consequences of work that transgresses your morals, often studied mainly within military populations, so military personnel seeing or being part of traumatic events which go against their own moral framework. It tends to disrupt how they make sense of the world, that meaning element again, and can lead to these kind of outcomes. So I'd like to take a positive psychology approach to this and look at something I'm calling moral benefit, which are the possible positive outcomes of being able to work in line with your own ethics. And part of the idea here is to have it available. I think this concept is available to a broader audience, so not just to military kind of personnel. So I'm thinking of this both at the worker and organisational level. So for workers, I'm predicting that being able to work in line with your ethics will enhance meaning in work, which will in turn enhance workplace well-being. You can see that this is very similar to the mediation model that we've already established in a general population, but now applied to workers. At an organisational level, we already know from past research that organisations that are higher in ethics tend to have more positive organisational outcomes, things like creativity, staff retention, sometimes profitability, although the research is a bit mixed. But yeah, a lot around staff retention and creativity. We also know that worker well-being tends to lead to these same sort of positive organisational outcomes. So what I'm proposing is that these two things, these two relationships are linked, in that where organisations are more ethical, it allows people to work in line with their ethics, which boosts their workplace meaning and well-being, which may explain some of these positive organisational outcomes. So another way of saying this is that the relationship down the bottom here between organisational ethics and positive organisational outcomes is explained by moral benefit at the worker level. So in terms of implications, if this works, I'd like to develop a new model linking ethics and positive workplace outcomes. I think this provides a possible additional pathway to increase worker well-being, which is an important topic at the moment. Something I'd like to test out is developing a mindfulness and ethics program, so bringing Western mindfulness, connecting it back with that ethical element. In addition, I think it provides a possible way to these positive organisational outcomes. And because of these two things, increasing worker well-being and positive organisational outcomes, I think it hopefully would maybe create greater motivation to focus on ethics in the workplace, which I think is really needed, and also particularly at the moment. So that's my plan. That's some of the stuff I've done, and that's my plan. A lot of the stuff, like some of that stuff, is future, and I'd really welcome any suggestions that you have or any questions that you have. Thank you. Yeah, perfect.
Some of the work we're doing with this longitudinal study with school principals is what I was thinking of is that the stress, the mental health, all of those sorts of issues, the principals are pretty high on that. And yet their job satisfaction is incredibly high.
Yes.
And I was trying to put that with there. Now I'm guessing probably the principals would have more sense of the impact than your aid workers would have.
Perhaps,
because they're sort of the local CEO. But,
Yeah.
I was just relating that to that research that we're doing.
Yeah, And I wonder if it's one of the things that principals sort of expect in their work. So one of the ideas we came up with the aid workers was that perhaps the trauma wasn't affecting them, because there is some work out there that shows if a difficulty is part of the identity of that career, then it's less likely to affect people. So say in the aid worker situation, they go into it knowing there's going to be trauma involved, and so this other study was essentially saying perhaps that doesn't affect them as much because it's almost part of the identity of that work, and I wonder if that affects the principals as well. They get into it knowing it's part of the role. Yeah. Thanks.
I also was thinking of, a lot of the research I do is looking at frame of reference effects, and that must be huge in this area in terms of what is ethical.
Yeah, and that's a tricky one, and I think it's maybe one of the reasons it's being avoided as a topic, because who are we to dictate, what other people should do? So I've been careful in my research so far to just let people come up with their own idea of what their ethical framework is, and make it more subjective rather than telling them what it is. And I think that's a tricky one when it comes to interventions, right? How much do you dictate ethics and how much do you let people develop themselves? Yeah. Thanks. Any other questions at all? Yes?
At the first, you were talking about your dissertation and study 5 or 6, and you gave an intervention on that. It seems separate from your later slides on your thinking about the underlying causes and meaning. Are they connected or separate, or have you learned more?
Sorry, do you mean like the acceptance commitment therapy intervention? Yeah. So at the moment, we're just doing a straight acceptance commitment therapy intervention with the aid workers, partly for simplicity because I'm coming to the end of my PhD. So it doesn't connect perfectly because what we found was meaning was a better predictor, a stronger predictor above and beyond psychological flexibility. So ideally, we'd have a real segment in there around meaning, just running out of time, so I'm postponing that till after the PhD. So you're right, it doesn't necessarily connect perfectly with what we've found. That's why I'd like to test ACT versus ACT plus meaning in the future. Great.
Could I ask something?
Of course.
Potentially controversial.
Go for it.
Is there any downside to being ethical?
Yes, I think this is where the ethical work alignment makes a difference. So if you're ethical in a non-ethical organisations, I can see real downsides.
We're in a non-ethical country.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Let's say in a much larger context where things like politicians are ignoring climate emergency and things of that nature.
Yeah.
The more aware you become of these situations,
the more stressful it is.
Yeah,
I think there is a downside, and I think there's a downside about something I didn't mention there, but something I'm interested in is ethical rigidity. So we tend to, like a strong ethical clarity would sort of imply this, I know what's right and wrong, and I think there are downsides to being too rigid though, and so maybe it's this in-between area that would be interesting to study. I don't know, I haven't studied it, but yeah, I can see what you're getting at. I think there are downsides to being...
Are you suggesting less mindfulness would be the intervention?
Less mindfulness. I guess, because,
mindlessness.
Yeah, because, there has been a lot of, media coverage at the moment around mindfulness and how maybe it doesn't connect very well to social change, just, people sitting in their own little bubble and not actually making any effect. I guess the idea is that maybe at an individual level, I don't know, but maybe at an individual level, yes, there would be downsides, but at a society-wide level, there'd be upsides, because if you don't increase ethics within individuals, how are we going to get change? Is that too optimistic? I don't know. Yeah. But that, I don't know, is the answer. But yeah, I can definitely see that there could be some downsides. Thinking at the organisational level, yeah, I think you could have real, and this is something that came through for the aid workers, something I didn't mention, but one of the big stresses was around witnessing corruption and how that impeded the impact that they were having in their work. So these were generally ethical people who were facing an unethical situation and system, and it really stressed them out. Yeah. Yes.
Just in relation to this, we collect a lot of data in organizations and corporations, and one of the things we've seen is if you see your organization as having an ethical mission, then you have more autonomy at work, which then is related directly to well-being. You can put more energy and volition into your work. You can believe that the overarching organization independent of you is doing good.
That's interesting.
That's with this point.
So how do you think it's affecting autonomy? So
because I think then you can be more volitional about contributing to that organization.
Okay.
It's more congruent and aligned with who you are.
Yeah, as opposed to going against what the organisation is standing for. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Possibly another mediator there. The same stuff. Yeah. Great.
This just comes from my experience seeing patients.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering how, maybe that could contribute to the discussion. Something I've noticed working with people from, let's say, individualistic culture, such as here, is increasingly a sort of pressure to find meaning in your work.
Yes.
And something I noticed from some folks more immigrated is that they don't seem to worry about that as much, or there's no kind of pressure to find meaning.
Yeah.
So I just wondered, how does that match up with your experience doing qualitative stuff?
Yeah.
Are there cultural expectations? Can people feel pressure to that meaning?
Definitely.
And that reduce a sense of meaning?
Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think there are downsides as well to seeking meaning in work. In that traditionally work was an avenue to get money, which you then used in your life to do what's meaningful for you, like you support your family or your hobbies and things like that. And there's been this increasing, I don't know if it's pressure or focus on getting meaning from our work, which can have a negative impact, I think, and like perhaps we're asking too much of a job to have, stability and financial gain, but also get meaning and enjoyment and job satisfaction from it. Yeah, maybe we're asking too much. I mean, there is some work out there looking at how this is divided. So in terms of some people just seek money from, they see it as a job. Some people see it, so it's job orientation. So some people see it as a job, some people see it as a career, so aiming to get further in it, to progress, and some people see it as a calling, so aiming to get meaning from their career. And that's roughly, in most workplaces, divided. It would change in high meaningful careers, but roughly divided 30%, like a third each. And so even in jobs that we think of as not necessarily meaningful, there are people who see it as a calling and really gain a lot of meaning.
Derive meaning
from something. There's work around hospital cleaners or garbage collectors deriving meaning from their work. So yeah, maybe this kind of stuff would be more applicable to the people who are in that calling third, who already want it. But yeah, I think you're definitely right. I think that it might be problematic to over-encourage people to seek meaning in their career, and it's something that you see a lot in school counselling and education. Like, follow your passion is a very common, phrase. But what does that mean, and how do you do it? And I think it can lead to a lot of angst for people at university.
And can we all do it?
And can we all do it? Yeah.
What about the percentage of people who can't do that?
It wasn't that they couldn't, they just weren't interested in that particular thing. So it was their orientation, their approach to work. Yeah, so the idea was that any job could be made meaningful, just some people were not seeking to make it meaningful. But yeah, is it necessarily a good thing for all people? No, I don't think so. Yes, thank you. All right, any more? Otherwise I'll finish up. Thanks so much for listening. It's been really good to be here and talk to you all. But if you have any other questions, come up and speak to me afterwards. Thank you.